Welcome back, everybody. It's the Decline and Fall show coming to you this week after our temporary absence for unavoidable English-related illness last week. Don't worry, I got over it. And we begin to explore this week a theme that was perhaps started with our deep dive into Agent Mason 000, first man ever afforded O status, with another look and a more extensive look at the dirty business of client journalism in Perfidious Albion. And you may be asking, why is there a rather extraordinary looking fellow's tweet on the screen here? And that is a tweet, of course, of a certain individual who goes by the name of Peter Jukes, which I'm not even sure if that's his real name. And this is another example of what you might call British information management. And I will read this out for the purpose of those listening onto the audio. Jukes, who, by the way, poses as something of an independent journalist, but his real story is one that I'm sure my comrade and collaborator Kit will illuminate us about in just a moment. But Jukes says the following regards to the Epstein case. The long and short of it is, however, in terms of Russian aids and money transfers, Epstein was heavily tied up with Russian intelligence, and its KGB-trained President Putin is so enamored of compromat, we've now naturalized the word. Now, aside from the fact that that's rather grammatically all over the place, what this represents is, of course, a theme that has been relentlessly pushed inside the British bourgeois press for now close on to 3 decades. In fact, since Putin came to power, starting with the Litvinenko poisoning and escalating from that, which is a combination of rabid anti-Russian propaganda combined with an attempt to mask the actual machinations of the British security state. And that brings us, of course, to who we're going to be discussing this week, which is not only Mr. Jukes there, whose tweet we can now mercifully get rid of. This is the person we're going to be focusing mainly on, though it will feature a rogues gallery of characters. That is a certain Carol Cadwalladr, extraordinary name, rather unextraordinary woman, who was all over the British press several years ago, claiming that she was about to crack open the British version of Russiagate, meaning that she was going to expose the Russian interference in the Brexit referendum of 2016 and blow the case wide open, that the whole thing was illegitimate. And if you just subscribe here, if you just contribute some money there, then the whole case will be revealed. But what was actually revealed through, amongst other things, a lawsuit brought against Carol by Aaron Banks of UKIP and Brexit fame or infamy, was that Carol, along with many others like her, is in essence a stenographer, as has been said before, who is handed stories by various different characters within the British security apparatus and carries them as if they were the gospel truth. Now, I will now throw to my friend and co-host, Kit Clarenberg, again coming to us from a very undisclosed location in the once and future socialist Yugoslavia. Kit, hello, and illuminate us. Who and what is a Carol Cadwalladr?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think at a base level, I think that Cadwalladr is, or Cadwalladr, I can never be bothered to learn how her surname's pronounced because she's just not worth the effort, quite frankly. She is one of, as you mentioned, a large, maybe not even large, a kind of an elite group of people who, during the absolute hysterical Russiagate frenzy, from about 2016 onwards, but we, as you said, we can trace this back a lot further. I think 2016 is when it really kind of kicked into gear. She was someone who gained an enormous amount of prominence for, as you say, peddling relentless anti-Russian propaganda, which was a product not only of her fevered imagination and imbecility, I'd say, but also a concerted propaganda effort by British, the Anglo-American security and intelligence apparatus, which fed her bullshit story after bullshit story after bullshit story that this person or that this movement or that group or blah 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 is somehow tied to Russia and therefore sinister. Cadwalladr is a one of a number of journalists who gained undue prominence for publishing whatever garbage was fed to her by MI5 and MI6 and intelligence cutouts like Integrity Initiative and the CIA. And she made an enormous amount of money as a result of this. She gave TED Talks as if she was some kind of scholar and expert on the threat posed to democracy by big tech and of course the dastardly Russians. She cultivated quite a significant cult following who were more than willing to part with their hard-earned cash to further her various dubious causes, which we'll get into in some detail in due course. And this while taking enormous amounts of money to do seemingly nothing from the shadowy tech and CIA-connected billionaire Pierre Midyar, who founded The Intercept and has a global media empire that he uses to further his political and commercial interests. Again, we'll get into this in some detail. But I think that the Duke's tweet is instructive because we for years throughout this Russiagate mania, whenever someone like Cadwalladr or Dukes made some insane accusation against Russia or suggested that even the weather was a result of Putin's evil weaponization of the climate or some other rubbish. When people like myself and yourself, Alex, and a great many others who have more than a double-digit IQ, said this is nonsense, we were tarred as Putin apologists, useful idiots of the Kremlin, and worse. And actually, before the Elon Musk takeover of Twitter, trying to rebut the lies of these people was grounds for suppression, censorship, and outright banning. Okay, I think that Duke's tweet, it shows where we've got to in so many ways. Where yes, literally everything, including the Epstein case, where anyone who has looked at this for more than 5 seconds can see very, very clearly that all of Epstein's close associates were CIA and Mossad connected. There is zero insinuation whatsoever that he was working for the Russians or any other intelligence service other than the CIA or Mossad. But we have reached the point where, despite the voluminous mountain of evidence indicating Epstein's true allegiances, there are still some people who are willing, probably because their salary depends on it, to toe the security state line and blame Russia. However, if there is a hint of optimism to be had, and I might say that this Russiagate hysteria has resulted in all sorts of deeply toxic phenomenon and developments. It has been fractious politically. It puts the West very deliberately on a war path with Russia. Like people have died as a result of this bullshit. But if there is a silver lining, it's that very, 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 very few people take this seriously anymore, because it has been consistently demonstrated to be total bullshit. And I think that these people this is best exemplified by the fact that recently the Byline Times, which is this very odd, allegedly independent media outlet, which has no clear means of support, but manages to have a film division, a podcast, and a print edition, which is sold in major retailers. I mean, quite how many people buy that rubbish. I'm not sure, but the the point is this, but that Byline hosted a festival. I believe it was at the it was the end of June. It might have been at the start of July. The audience, to the extent that it existed, was a bunch of sandal and sock wearing very old white people. Like the FBPE crowd who, are absolutely desperate to overturn Brexit. The kind of the centrist Remainer dad types. Like, this is who still takes this nonsense seriously. The wider public have moved on, or indeed, yes, can see that it is absolute rubbish. But that's certainly not to diminish the enormous amount of damage wrought by people like Cadwalladr and her coterie of what and my friend and colleague Aaron Mate refers to as blue or not, deranged conspiracy theorists who need to believe that the election of Trump wasn't because the American working class, as you can see on screen, the heaving turnout for Byline Times Festival, which was headlined with a chat between Carol Cadwalladr and Carol Vorderman. I might add that Carol Vorderman appeared on Question Time. Carol Vorderman appeared on Question Time in 2010, and Dimbleby said the program is meant to last an hour. It felt a lot longer than it usually does because of her presence there. Right. And this was while Vorderman was tapped as Michael Gove's personal maths guru. So again, it says something about the actual politics of Cadwalladr, which are anything other than radical or anti-state. Now, yes, so that's a kind of farcical and amusing full stop to what has been, as we're going to get into right now, been a career typified by lies, libel, incompetence, total deference and obsequy to the security and intelligence services and state power, which has wrought enormous amounts of havoc.
Yes, and it should be emphasized here that the Brexit debate, such as it was in this country, was never, along with every other debate you feature in the bourgeois press, which is why we have a show to explain these things properly, was designed to mask the reality of what Brexit was. And I start with this because I think it's Brexit which made Carol into the household name amongst the sandal and sock brigade that she became for a while, because it was this political moment in 2016 which caused a meltdown in the British political system, which it's still not recovered from. It probably was the final shot that was to finish off the Conservative Party, and its now withered corpse will testify to. But what it comes from, Brexit, is fundamentally a division within the British ruling class over the correct methods of imperial management and of correct methods of maintaining Britain's place in the world. Now, just to give a brief explainer on this, you have essentially a division into two camps. So these camps are completely unified on the need for Britain to remain the great imperial power. They're completely unified on the need to maintain the British ruling class's ability to exploit resources and labor and markets anywhere in the world. They're completely unified on the rights, as they see it, of the British ruling class to bomb, murder, and kill anybody who gets in the way. But what this is a division over is a division in tactics. Is it best to be out there with their primary influence being exerted to the West over the decision-making process in Washington, D.C., and in partnership with the brute force of the Americans so that they can use that when they need it? Or is it best to maintain a foot in the camp of the European Union in order to best steer that? And it's broadly a division between those ruling class interests who have their who are invested in enterprises more outside of like the sort of European Eurasian theater, so in Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, and those who still see the European market, and more specifically the Eastern European market, as something which is something that they want to get more into. And this division has been animating British bourgeois politics for over 30 years. In fact, since the late 1980s. It started with the reunification of Germany with the West German annexation of the East, and it became a problem because the British ruling class suddenly realized that a unified Germany would be something that could rival them, certainly inside Europe and more widely as well. So this division festered away inside the Conservative Party for 20 plus years before finally exploding in 2016 with the fatal decision, as it turns out, by David Cameron to try and solve this internal party division by having a referendum. What he didn't realize was that this would become a lightning rod for all kinds of discontent within the population that would then look to give the establishment, as they saw it, a kick. Now, behind this lay forces which we have discussed before, such as Gwydion Prince and his friends, and the perennial show favourite Chris Donnelly, who were on the pro-Brexit side because they're like ultra imperialist, libertarian view of things was of a stripped-down British state, Singapore-on-Thames, as they put it, which was allied really only with the United States as a means of maintaining and extending British influence around the world. They saw the European Union and the need to bargain with the French and the Germans and others as a barrier to this. And so they were the sort of section of the ruling class that was on the pro-Brexit side. The pro-EU side was equally represented in the City of London, but as I said, faced more in a European direction. And they attempted to disguise this division by coding things and dressing things up in all manner of different ways. Carol, our friend today, is one of those ways in which they sought to dress this up, by perennially bringing up things like Russian subversion, etc. And the talk of this began almost as soon as the vote was over. But as I said in the introduction, it goes back a long way. Anti-Russian stories in the British press have been floating around almost as long as Putin's been president. And it comes out of the fact that Putin started to put certain limits on on the power of British and American capital within Russia. And so immediately you start to get hysterical stories about Putin is either the next Stalin, the next Peter the Great, the next Ivan the Terrible, or all of the above. This also includes the coverage of things like the Litvinenko poisoning, the Skripal affair, which we've discussed before, and anything else that goes wrong in Britain is ascribed to the machinations of the Russians. So this became Carol Cadwalladr's wheelhouse between roughly 2016 and 2020. And this, as you shared with me, Kit, something which I'll now just put on the screen for viewers and listeners, which is that this is not something which is new, but this is an old strategy of the British intelligence men who have been practicing it for an awful long time, as this 2014 article from the Institute for Statecraft points out, isn't that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that yes, the just as by way of preface as well, I would say I was trying to make a point about Trump. Is I think that in 2016 you basically had this 1-2 punch to liberal elites, which was first Brexit and then Trump, and you had a large number of people who were desperately trying to rationalize why this had happened, and they were unable to, and unwilling to consider that that there's liberalism and particularly neoliberalism has failed and immiserated an enormous number of people, and it offers them absolutely nothing, and it's created an enormous amount of grievances with the majority of the populations of not only Britain and America, but I would say increasingly Europe as well. Both Brexit and the election of Trump represented people were given a button that basically said F you, and they pressed it. right? And liberals couldn't deal with this. Now, on the one hand, you had people like Carol Cadwalladr, who was more than willing to act as a lightning rod for their grievances, because she very much fits into that kind of pampered upper middle class, or indeed upper class background, and probably shared their probably like legitimately shared their concerns that something went wrong here. How could anyone possibly vote to leave the EU? It's wonderful and multicultural and, strength in diversity, blah, blah, blah. But it also was very convenient, these two events, from the perspective of British intelligence, because, yes, ever since the Maidan coup, there were elements of Britain's military and intelligence establishment who wanted to use, as Alex and I have discussed, Parsim on this show, but do check out our prior episodes. They remain unmissable, and of urgency still. The point is that from that point onwards, from Maidan onwards, there were elements of British intelligence who were preparing for war, and they wanted to use Ukraine as the beachhead for that. So in July 2014, this organization, the Institute for Statecraft, it was set up by Chris Donnelly, who we've again discussed at length from this show, a veteran British senior advisor to NATO, a senior British Ministry of Defence apparatchik for many years, also a member of the British military intelligence. In July 2014, the website of the Institute for Statecraft publishes this essay written by Victor Madeira, who is a very spooky individual indeed. In it, he compares the present situation to the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. And Madeira says it was understood by senior British government apparatchiks in the late 1920s that they were effectively in a new kind of war with the Soviet Union, and they had to therefore undertake anti-subversive measures, including economic boycott, breach of diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, as well as propaganda and counter-propaganda pressure on neutrals. This would create a diplomatic breach in Moscow that would turn the present peculiar struggle into an armed conflict of the old-fashioned sort that Great Britain and the West could win. So he's making that historical allusion and applying it to the present. And what Madeira is effectively saying here is we need to create the conditions for all-out war with Russia, because we can win it. And then Integrity Initiative, which was spun out of the Institute for Statecraft, set about doing this. And their primary method of doing so was by spreading disinformation under the aegis of countering disinformation about Russian meddling. So they transformed Brexit into a Russian plot. They played a significant role in the Russiagate farce. They were involved in spreading similar narratives the world over, and in the process, average members of the public across the West, but also governments which had hitherto been kind of neutral on Russia, or even kind of pro-Russia to an extent, were turned against Russia. Now, von Clausewitz said, war is the extension of diplomacy via other means. When you are trying to diplomatically isolate Russia at a time when Russia was seeking a diplomatic solution to the crisis in Donbass, and the brutal crackdown by Maidan authorities on Russian speakers in the region, it was well understood that, when we cut off all of these diplomatic avenues, and we have sufficiently demonized Russia to an extent that they are viewed as, Putin is viewed as this kind of combination of Stalin, Ivan the Terrible, and probably Hitler as well. Then there's no public support. Indeed, it becomes verboten to even talk to Russia. let alone make concessions. And so that this was about putting the West on the warpath with Russia very deliberately. And an example I've written about this for my website, but a very practical example of the real world impact of Integrity Initiative's anti-Russian propaganda is provided by Spain. Now, Spain has historically had good relations with Russia. Its government was actually, to an extent, in the early 2010s, comprised of people who believed that it was sensible and necessary to have at least constructive, if not happy and harmonious relations with Moscow, because they effectively shared the same continent. And it's unwise to provoke a massive nuclear armed and power with an enormous military, which you effectively border. It's just basic common sense, but this has been obviously rather lost now on policymakers throughout Europe and North America. But the point is Integrity Initiative in internal documents stated that Spain was very difficult. It was very difficult to try and turn the Spanish public and Spanish government against the Russian government, and it was very difficult to make the Spanish feel that they were under attack by the Russians. Now, when in 2017 the Catalan independence movement got going, and there were brutal police crackdowns on pro-independence activists and protesters. This gifted Integrity Initiative an ideal opportunity to seed a narrative of Russian meddling. And Integrity Initiative fed dossiers of falsified data and all sorts of other very dubious, fact-free claims that the Catalan independence movement was being run by the Russian government one way or another. Now, this resulted in the government of Spain designating Moscow a hostile threat when they hadn't been before. And it also, you can see this in opinion polling, it turned a significant number of Spanish citizens against Russia. Right. And this is just one example. The Integrity Initiative did this all over Europe in the years leading up to the proxy war. And
and this is of course where that story goes. Grifters do follow, because the British state suddenly, and of course certain elements within the American intelligence services, were pushing this narrative, and they needed a bunch of essentially hired guns, or should we say hired Blackberries, in this case, to sell this shit to the population. So this is where we bring in, of course, our old friend, Agent Paul Mason, who has been loyally plowing this furrow for many years, but also today's star term, which is, of course, Cadwalladr, who, as Kit says, was writing about this stuff with a combination of frenzied hysteria, that if you read, for instance, the articles that she wrote, it is combined with what I can only describe as cringing deference to the institutions of the British state, Parliament, monarchy, though that wasn't quite as overt with Carol, still likes to play this sort of pseudo-Republican game, I think, but also, and most importantly, the security services and their associated bodies. And in the lawsuit that she ended up having to fight with one of the funders of UKIP and the one of the lead campaigns, Aaron Banks, this admittedly incredibly shady businessman with interests all over the place, who is undoubtedly a dodgy bastard, but just not the kind of dodgy bastard that Carol was alleging, perhaps. But the point is that during this during this case that Banks brought against her for defamation, it was revealed by Carol Cadwalladr's own witness statement that she was fed stories related to alleged Russian interference in the Brexit referendum by a character named Ben Bradshaw. Now, Ben Bradshaw is a very, very uber Blairite Labour MP. He also looks like the desiccated corpse of David Bowie brought back to life and given a serious ketamine habit. Um, he links her up with all manner of like security service front organizations like the Atlantic Council, with people such as Edward Lucas, who's a big booster for the NATO war in Ukraine. People like Ben Nimmer, a self-described disinformation expert, who was all over like the anti-Russian stories from several years ago. And she openly states that this is where she was getting a lot of the analysis of Russia from. And these think tanks and individuals that are associated with them, these all ultimately go back to MI5 and MI6, MI6 in particular. But she is essentially being given stories, again, by her own admission, by the security services, and just running with them. Because, you know, the MI6 says so, therefore I'll do it. Now, I'm not going to get into what her motivations might be. Could be financial. Could be that she's a long-term stooge of the security services. Could be that she's an idiot who just believes anything that she's told by a man with a posh accent. Could be all of the above. But this is the kind of like client journalism that is revealed in the Banks versus Cadwalladr court case. And it typifies really her whole career. And there's many more like her across what used to be described as Fleet Street.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that this witness statement, it is worth reading in its entirety, because it is just absolutely astonishing insight into how Cadwalladra's career operated and how she gained prominence, which, as you say, is basically just publishing whatever rubbish was passed to her by spooky individuals, organizations which effectively act as cutouts of British intelligence, including Integrity Initiative, and various well-connected individuals who have sources in MI5 and MI6. And that's where she got all of her stories from. A particularly egregious example of this is provided in its point 75 in the witness statement. She records how a confidential source in the US suggested I look closely at Nigel Farage, the then UKIP leader, and the timing of a visit he made to Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks founder, at the Ecuadorian embassy in March, I believe that was 2017. The subsequent on that same day, this is when that WikiLeaks publishes Vault 7, which led the CIA, which was all about the CIA hacking programs and other dirty work, which angered the CIA so much they drew up plans to assassinate Assange. Now, the reality is that Nigel Farage, in his capacity as a LBC presenter, went to the Ecuadorian embassy, asked for an interview with Assange, and he was rebuffed and then went home. But Carol Cadwalladr spun this into a conspiratorial article, which is called When Nigel Farage Met Julian Assange, and it has all sorts of quotes from anonymous intelligence sources suggesting this could have been a covert means of Assange providing information via Farage to the ever omnipresent Russians and or Donald Trump. It is complete and utter rubbish, on a par with Luke Harding's infamous exclusive report on how Paul Manafort visited Assange at the Ecuadorian embassy many times. Of course, the Ecuadorian embassy was under 24/7 intensive surveillance by a Spanish security company called UC Global, which was doing spying on Assange's every movement, including his visits to the toilet. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He couldn't cough or sneeze without the CIA knowing about it. So they would have known this story was bullshit. But not only that, as my friend John McAvoy has exposed for Mint Press News, The Guardian at this time was in regular contact with UC Global and getting given dirt on Assange to report on. So they would have well known again that this story was complete bullshit, but they published it anyway. And it furthered this ludicrous narrative. I think that the way that she signs off, the way that she describes WikiLeaks is the swirling vortex at the center of everything. Yeah, and as we've discussed on this show before, this is a very common tactic with all these Russiagate lunatics and people like Paul Mason, is they create this nebulous blob of things that they don't like and find connections between them, no matter how tangential, to claim that there's some grand conspiracy they're fighting. When in reality, they are prostitutes for state power. Yes. I mean, quite how more hasn't been made of this witness statement, where it's like, in her own words, she is describing being given stories by MI5 and MI6. There is an extensive section in it where she talks about how she was approached by an organization that was funded by the foreign office. It's quite clear that she was talking about that she was talking about Integrity Initiative. Integrity Initiative gave her a dossier of dodgy evidence about banks' alleged Kremlin connections, which she didn't end up publishing. They probably thought that she would have just, published and be damned, because that's typically the way she operated. But she was seemingly more careful in this case. But yeah, I mean, and I think as well that there is another aspect to this, which I think that we should that we would mention in passing, but it does bear repeating, is one of the as exemplified by that tweet by Jude, one of the key political utilities of having Russia to blame for everything is that it shifts attention, or it can be used to shift attention away from the crimes of Anglo-American intelligence, right? And I think that Cambridge Analytica, which we could do a deeper dive into, although it's quite a labyrinthine question. Cambridge Analytica was, this is breaking the story of how Cambridge Analytica hacked Facebook, quote unquote, when they actually didn't, and helped Trump win, and they got a leave vote in Brexit when neither is true. That Cambridge Analytica was a fundamentally British company staffed by British, often military and intelligence veterans, and it was spun out of SCL Group, which was founded by a kind of old Etonian who had previously gone out with a member of the royal family, I believe, and it was rumored to have worked for MI5. Early on, when Cadwalladr got on this story, she, to an extent, acknowledged the fact that Cambridge Analytica was a British entity. And there's one article from May 2017 in which she interviewed someone who worked for the company, who said it was like working for MI6, only it's MI6 for hire. You got to do some really cool things, fly all over the world. It's not like election campaigns in the West. You got to do all sorts of crazy shit. And bearing in mind that SEL/Cambridge Analytica is just one of a constellation of contractors run by MI5 and MI6 people, which are, engaged in psychological warfare operations, all sorts of arm's length skullduggery. I've written about the activities of some of these companies extensively. And to give you an example, there's a firm called Torchlight, which is stacked with ex-GCHQ, MI6 and military people that provides training to repressive security forces, which trains foreign intelligence services in countries like Jordan, where you can go to jail for social media posts, how to hack into people's phones. It also runs, like PSYOPs overseas. There are a large number of these companies that effectively act as arm's length actors for British intelligence and indeed the British military. They never ever get reported on in the media. So there was a utility to fudging Cadwalladra's reporting on this, which is distracted attention from what Britain gets up to overseas, which never really gets talked about with any seriousness in the mainstream media. And it somehow blamed Russia for Cambridge Analytica's alleged crimes. despite the fact they had no links to Russia whatsoever.
No, and they are, as you correctly emphasize, a fundamentally a British organization which operate as a outsource intelligence firm that is a very useful thing for the for intelligence organizations to have, because it's arm's length plausible deniability shit. Plus, it makes money for a bunch of guys who've come through MI6 and then gone into business for themselves. But principally, their client is their principal client will always be the British ruling class, either in state form or non-state form. And this, the noise around them being in the employ of the Russians via shady Americans linked to Trump, like Robert Mercer, this was a distraction, a smokescreen put up to disguise the real activities of this organization, which certainly Carol Cadwalladr either doesn't want to talk about or doesn't care to know. I would say probably a combination of the two. Carol is a tremendously intellectually incurious individual, it must be said. But Cambridge Analytica is just one of this constellation of non-state but state-linked actors, which were all over various different things, including, of course, various plots in overseas countries, which we could get into in future episodes. But again, the consistent trend with journalists like Carol Cadwalladr is that even when they report on an organization like Cambridge Analytica, which is manifestly they are a story in and of themselves that is worth investigating, they look at exactly the wrong thing. They present it in a completely upside down way, so that the average reader or viewer or listener will not really grasp the fact that this is a British intelligence operation. Just as the whole purpose of Carol Cadwalladr's journalism over Brexit was to disguise the fact that this was a fundamentally British row between two different sections of the ruling class. They actually has to drag in, on the orders of her masters, of course, Russia and bad foreign actors, Trump, etc., whose influence over all of this was absolutely minimal. And also, it involved, as Kit emphasized at the top of the program, the more you can blame external players, the less you have to talk about the internal factors which led to Brexit in the first place, or led to the Brexit vote in the first place, which The Guardian and the collection of tremendously smug bastards who read it and still pay for the fucking thing will never want to talk about in a million years. So Carol's state-sponsored journalism is always doing a service for the same people she purports to hate, essentially. It's a dog and pony show, and brought to you by absurdly overpaid morons at The Guardian. So that's one aspect of this, but other aspects include other people we've mentioned on the program before, including, of course, old friend of yours, Kit, certain Mr. Pierre Omidyar, amongst others. So what is the connection, can you tell us, between Carol Cadwalladr and Pierre Omidyar? And maybe you could inform the good viewers and listeners of exactly what game Pierre Omidyar has been playing with pseudo-independent media for quite some time.
Yeah, sure. So Pierre Omidyar is he is at once kind of shadowy, but also he sought to be a public figure and made much of his philanthropy. He founded eBay and made an astonishing amount of money, and his personal wealth is valued at around 9-10 billion. He founded the Intercept with much fanfare, and I think that he kind of regrets that now. But more generally, he runs a global media network, often in direct coordination with the CIA and US aid. In Ukraine, he was funding numerous pro-Maidan opposition outlets in the lead up to Yankovic's ouster in February 2014. Elsewhere, for instance, in West Africa, and we have a West Africa special coming, funnily enough, that he effectively owns a significant proportion of Africa's tech sector. Now, since in a since memory holds reports from 2016, his Omidyar network or Omidyar Foundation, it published a report which boasted about how his funding of media had motivated citizens and governments to act in a way that furthered his commercial interests. So that in itself is a kind of a rather important point to bear in mind when you think that since 2020 he has given Carol Cadwalladr's The Citizens, which is allegedly a campaign group, $1.5 million, or the best part thereof. Records of a lot of this funding have been, here we go, people-powered media innovation in West Africa. It details very openly how he has sought to influence politics and regulations, laws, perceptions. It is very Bond villainish. Actually, and in considering that Cadwalladr talks a big game about how she opposes the quote unquote broligarchy, and is all about trying to take down the tech giants, including Facebook, which Omidyar, funnily enough, seems to hate. The fact that he has given Cadwalladr so much money should tell you that that's not her mission at all, and she's not actually concerned about the influence of tech over our lives. It's only very specific forms of tech and very specific individuals involved in the sphere. Now, yes, from 2020 onwards, the Citizens, which for most of its lifetime, it still exists now, hasn't had a functional website, started receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars year in, year out from Pierre Omidyar. It's really not clear what this money was spent on or where it went. As I say, like you would think that the first thing to do as a campaign group would to have a functioning website, and they didn't for many years. Although while it spent many years under construction, at one stage it had a profile of disgraced MI6 spy Christopher Steele, which specifically boasted of how he had compiled the Trump-Russia dossier, which at this stage is so utterly discredited. It's not the kind of thing anyone would want to be associated with, let alone endorse in any way. But Cadwalladr appears undeterred, which could be, as you said, a mixture of her salary, depending on it, her own incompetence and stupidity and credulity, or something even darker. But the point is that, so yes, we have Omidyar who funds media specifically to influence government and citizen action. Now, probably the crowning achievement of the Citizens, and this is a dubious distinction to say the least, was the creation of an organization called Independent Sage. Now, it's rather forgotten now, but during the pandemic, Independent Sage, which was named after the British government's own scientific advisory group for emergencies, which oversaw the government's pandemic response, Independent Sage played this weird role of, on the one hand, calling for the strictest, harshest lockdown measures possible, including just keeping lockdowns on a rolling basis for years and years and years, and shutting down everything, like going for and pursuing zero COVID via like not allowing children to go to school, not allowing people to go to work, basically just keeping everyone locked up in their homes. Now, interestingly, Pierre Omidyar, his wealth during the pandemic grew exponentially because he had a range of quote-unquote COVID-proof business interests, including educational tech so children could learn from home, streaming services, which people, with nothing to do, locked at home, turn to. The questions abound as to whether the money given by Omidyar was spent on independent Sage. Now, what this becomes even more sinister when one considers that independent Sage ran, I think, more than one crowdfunder to support its operations at a time when, people in Britain were facing unemployment, financial uncertainty, hardship. And I've reported for the Grey Zone based on leaked emails. There were elements within independent Sage, including an academic named Alison Pollock, who is an absolutely excellent independent thinker. She was very critical of this proposal and said, look, we're all in employment, we're all on very good salaries. Why should we be asking the public for money? And as a result of raising such concerns and indeed dissenting from independent Sage's prescriptions on how masks should be made mandatory for everyone above the age of like 2 years old in the entire country at all times, indoors and outdoors, she got turfed out of independent Sage. And it's clear, based on, if you have the time, please do read this article I wrote for the Grey Zone back in November 2022. She was forced out, and it seems pretty clear that Cadwalladr might have had something to do with this, because they clashed repeatedly. And this supposedly scientific collective was taking direction on what it should say and how it should act, and its media performances by Carol Cadwalladr directly. That is yes, quite a rabbit hole to go down, but I think it's worthy of inspection, because this is about the only thing that the Citizens has done. Of course, actually, they have tried. They've made various attempts to do other things, including crowdfunding a legal action against the British government for failing to properly investigate Russian interference in Brexit. They raised enormous amounts of money, again, despite receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars from Omidyar's Illuminate Foundation. This effort was pretty promptly thrown out by a High Court judge on the basis that their case was completely inarguable. Undeterred, they crowdfunded again to bring this case to review at the European Court of Human Rights. Now, on July 21st, this just only caught my eye recently. They've obviously not tried to make much noise about this. The European Court of Human Rights has agreed with the British High Court's decision that this is just a complete and utter rubbish, nonsense, and the British government is not at fault for failing to investigate alleged Russian conspiracies around the Brexit vote. From the aforementioned Ben Bradshaw, was part of this legal action. I think you're doing David Bowie a tremendous disservice by likening them actually at it. But it's like, but I think that in effect, I even though this effort failed, and I think that it's absolutely shameful, just on like a kind of on an ethical level, to have crowdfunded for this utter rubbish to further this completely non-existent. This is just this completely ludicrous notion that Russia was somehow responsible for Brexit. It remains useful, because on top of, as we've discussed, giving this explanation to a liberal class that doesn't want to stare reality in the face, it also just contributes to a wider negative wall of noise and thoroughly poisoned well around all things Russia. Like my friend and colleague Aaron Mate has given a talk about how there are many Democrats in the US who rabidly support Ukraine on the basis that they think Ukraine is at war with the country that attacked them. Like with Russiagate, which again originated in London, and Cadwalladr was a significant player in pushing this absolute rubbish and cheering for the FBI and the CIA, and claiming that Robert Mueller was going to deliver the goods and was going to rescue us from the tyranny of Trump. And then nothing happened because it was total bullshit. There are people in the US who still firmly believe that Trump's election in 2016 was a Pearl Harbor or 9/11 event, and that Russia and that they're effectively at war with the country that declared war on them. And for years you had senior intelligence officials, both current and former, on CNN and MSNBC. All of these liberal networks got massive ratings, relentlessly perpetuating this rubbish about Russian election interference or hacking or whatever, and yet that there were senior politicians and senior government officials who were saying they declared war on us, they attacked us, and it had a huge impact. It laid the foundations for what's happening now. And as I say, it made any suggestion of trying to find a negotiated resolution to the crisis in Donbass impossible. It laid the foundations for Russia being forced into the position where, we now have to do something about the Russian speakers in Donbass, which are a significant majority of the public has been calling for us to do since 2014. This cuts across ideologies and demographics in Russia, ranging from liberals to nationalists to communists. There was a sense that the Russian government wasn't doing enough, and up to the wire, the Russians were still trying to get Minsk implemented. They didn't want this, but the possibility of that happening was made zero by people like Carol Cadwalladr.
Yes, and this is the purpose of her entire miserable career, it would seem. I mean, we could do 6 hours just on her bizarre confessions in her witness statement alone. But I did want to highlight one other thing, which before we closed out the hour, which is the repeated returning to the question of the Skripal Institute. It's been we've talked about this before. You've written about this, but I think this is one of the key things, and one of the absolutely crucial, shall we say, turning points on the road to 2022 and the beginning of the special military operation, which is the wholly unproven claims of the people like Carol Cadwalladr, who goes on and on about this, about Russia using a biological weapon on British soil, which, again, they've never been proved. They've never been asked to prove it. It was when Corbyn raised the smallest question about this. People like Carol Cadwalladr said, "Oh my God, look at this! In the pay of Putin, etc., etc., etc." But this was a key incident that, again, is still unclear as to exactly what happened. It is unclear as to exactly where the Skripals are now. It is unclear exactly what killed the semi-homeless woman, Dawn Sturgis, who found something on the street, or what role the British government itself played in all of this, other than, of course, the clear role that it played in the aftermath, which is to use this as a propaganda tool against Russia. And what Kit says is correct. What you've seen for 20 plus years in the British bourgeois press is this relentless drumbeat of propaganda designed to deliver the result we got in late February, early March of 2022, which is the war that the British ruling class fought that they could win against Russia, which is lure them into Ukraine, stymie them, but not beat them on the battlefield because they knew they couldn't do that, and then use the sanctions to destroy, they hoped, the Russian economy, and ultimately to destabilize the Russian state and to bring back a Yeltsin-type figure to run it. That's the aim, as we've emphasized over and over again. An aim which, of course, people like Carol were rabidly enthusiastic about, because it means, of course, a payday for them. Now, the Skripal incident is part of this. It's part of getting us to the point where in March of 2022, it was even more, and remains so to this day, even more impossible to find a dissenting voice over the Ukraine issue than there was over the Palestine issue. It's an even more impressive propaganda job that has been done, and it goes back 2 decades, and people like Cadwalladr are right at the center of it, along with Agent Mason, Peter Dukes, and every other faux oppositionist liberal scumbag out there who's carried the water for this for the best part of 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is worth bearing in mind as well. I mean, in respect of Skripal, it's something that I've written about extensively. I have considered writing a book about it. This is so many questions remain open and grave about precisely what happened. I might add that in the spirit of laying foundations, there is a document from, I think it's 2015, that was again produced by the aforementioned Victor Madeira, who was calling for all-out war with Russia in July 2014. It lays out all sorts of levers for, quote unquote, levers for achieving regime change, and a lot of it is about completely freezing out Russia from the West, culturally, financially, banning Russians from attending British universities, expelling masses of Russian diplomats, from as many countries as possible. This happened after Skripal, as did many other things noted in this document. Now, Integrity Initiative was in charge of the British government's propaganda operations related to Skripal before they were contracted to do this, before any basic facts had been ascertained, before it was even very clear what had happened to the Skripals, what they'd been poisoned with, etc. Which raises the very obvious question of who was actually responsible. And there was an amazing quote from one of Skripal's associates. I believe his name was Valery Morozov, who was he was likewise a defector who's exiled to Britain, who revealed in the days after Skripal was allegedly poisoned that Skripal remained in regular contact with Russia's embassy in London, met with Russian military intelligence officers there monthly. And he also dismissed any suggestion the Kremlin had anything to do with this by saying, why on earth would the Kremlin go after this fucking nobody who served his time in jail, doesn't pose any threat to Russia? Putin he's not someone Putin thinks about. There's no reason for this, and it's more dangerous for them for such things to happen. But such rational consideration was completely suppressed or indeed demonized by the likes of Cadwalladr and Dukes and others. And they're still at it today. And I think that, again, if there is a cause for optimism within, cautious optimism, is that this stuff is working on an ever increasingly fewer number of people. It's kind of similar to how Israeli propaganda doesn't work anymore. For the overwhelming majority, apart from the true believers in Zionism, it doesn't really work. And I think also as well, it points to the fact that the reason that external factors are still being blamed, we're now nearly 10 years since the Brexit vote. The reason that these quote unquote debates and all this conspiracy theorizing is going on is because the British establishment is effectively on its knees. And it has no way of resolving its enduring fantasies of remaining a major global power with the reality of its terribly foreshortened economic, military, and diplomatic might in the world. And I think this is one of the reasons that the British cannot give up on Ukraine, because they, from their perspective, what the Anglo-American Empire is on the line in Donbass. I mean, as we've discussed many times, the Americans could easily extricate themselves from this. They have enormous, internal wealth to hoover up, probably at the expense of the local environment. They have a whole continent slash quote unquote backyard to beat up and bully and rape and pillage. They are more than happy and more than willing, I would say, to leave the Europeans, particularly the British, to their own devices. And this is why the Ukraine proxy war cannot be given up on. The L cannot be taken, because that is another Suez moment from Britain's perspective, which perhaps even more significant ramifications than the first time round.
Yeah. This is why, of course, there is no dissent allowed. It's why they've been at this propaganda game for 20 years. It's why people like Cadwalladr has a job, or had a job. I'm not sure what she's doing now. She's usually spending the millions from Pierre Omidyar. And this also, I think it's a good point to conclude on, gives you an insight, along with our special agent Mason, as to the real purpose of most journalism done by bourgeois outlets. Like, most of it is propaganda. Like all that stuff you saw that we put up on screen from Carol Cadwalladr about Brexit, about Julian Assange meeting with Nigel Farage, etc. All the stuff from Luke Harding, which of course Aaron Mate masterfully exposed in an interview, a notorious interview with him several years ago on the Real News. All that stuff. These are stories that are as fictional as anything written by Jeffrey Archer, or for that matter, anything said by Jeffrey Archer in court. These are stories. These are made up. This is like, and this isn't in the Sun or the now defunct News of the World. This is in like the so-called quality newspapers. This is in the Guardian. This is in the Observer. This is in the Times, etc. And so the things that we are taught to trust as people who grow up in old perfidious Albion, like broadsheet newspapers, the BBC, etc., heroic campaigning journalists, these are all lies. These are all, at most, they are deeply compromised figures, or should we say, or at least they are deeply compromised figures. At the very worst, they are, as Agent Mason is, a direct employee in all but name of the British state itself. Propaganda in an imperialist country has to be absolutely comprehensive. In the words of William Casey, and I'll finish on this point, the former director of the CIA and former also campaign director of Ronald Reagan's presidential campaign in 1980, we all know our job is done when everything that the American public believes to be true is false. If true in the United States, even more true in perfidious Albion, where the empire is older, the decay more pronounced, and the need for absolute cover-up is absolutely imperative. Kit, final word to you.
Well, I mean, first, beautifully, brutally, and eloquently put, my dear friend, and fellow conjurer of arcane facts. But I mean, I might add on that theme. I'd like to quote you. In fact, a few weeks back, we did a podcast with Sina Tusi, who runs East is a Podcast. It's a fantastic show. Do check it out. Not just our episode. I mean, the show in general is very, very good. But like, yeah, Alex stated, well, in Britain, it's not Plato's cage. You're not seeing images projected onto a wall of reality. You are seeing the inside of a blindfold. And again, it is because of people like Agent Mason and creepy Peter Jukes and Carol Codswallop that people are seeing the inside of blindfolds. And I think that the again, it is a testament to, in a sense, British decline, that people are increasingly seeing through this, and they can see the reality, and they can see where the true threats lie. So again, cautious optimism for a better future. It's a shame that it took everything. It's a shame that we've gotten to where we are, how we did. But there is the prospect of a better tomorrow. And I might add that, yes, that Carol Cadwalladr was formally terminated as an employee of the Observer when it was bought by Tortoise Media, which is very spooky operation funded by BP, but also claims to be very concerned about the environment. So again, something to celebrate. Cadwalladr is formally out of a job.
Well,
Right.
that is an excellent note to conclude this broadcast on. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and the Substack, and follow us on Twitter or X if you prefer. But until next time, it's good afternoon from me up in Glasgow.
Mm-hmm. And it's a good afternoon from me in the once and future Yugoslavia. God bless you all. Thanks for tuning in. See you soon.
See you next time.